Okay, well, I think it's time to start. Just wanted to say thank you for joining us. My name is Mariah Jameson. I lead communications for the Strategic Insights team. Can we move to the next agenda slide, please? Here's our agenda for the next hour. First, we'll hear a brief opening from Vikram Singh, our Senior Director of RMI's Global South team. Then we'll move to Kingsmill Bond, energy strategist at RMI, who will share the findings from our recent report. Vikram will offer some closing thoughts, and then we will open up for Q&A. You can send questions at any time during the Q&A function, and again, we very much encourage you to do so. We will get to as many as we can. Vikram, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, it's an honor to address you today and share some climate optimism during these times. Before I begin, in addition to Mariah's Halloween wishes, I wanted to wish a happy Diwali to the approximately 2 billion people around the world that celebrate that holiday. It is an important occasion and quite coincidental that we're delivering this happy news to you on this day. I'd also like to thank Suleiman Babumanu, the head of our Africa work, Akshay Megate, the head of our India team, Winnie Riskiningayu, the head of our Southeast Asia team, David Gums, the head of Islands, and Leticia Demares, who many of you may know, who works in climate diplomacy and is working on our work related to the new collective quantified goal leading up to COP very soon. A special shout out to Kingsmill, Dan and Sam for supplying the data here. This was a Global South-led initiative, and we very much, were slicing and dicing ideas throughout the summer, which coincidentally happened to coincide with some recent reports from the IEA and IRENA, but that was not originally planned. But I'll get to that in a second. What we're excited about to discuss today is the explosion of clean tech across the Global South. In a single year, in a single technology, we're providing as much new electricity as the entirety of the global growth the year before. Let me say that again. In a single year, in a single technology, we're providing as much new electricity as the entirety of global growth the year before. That's big news. A decade or two ago, analysts did not imagine in their wildest dreams that solar, by the middle of the 2020s, would already be supplying all of the growth of global electricity demand. Yet, here we are today. What's driving this? There are several important factors, as published in the executive summary of this report, if you've had a chance to see it. If not, I invite you to download it. But I'd particularly like to call out the importance of finally achieving CapEx parity, capital expenditure parity. The halving of solar and battery costs in 2023 means that the upfront cost of solar has fallen to the same level as fossil fuel generation, and the purchase cost of electric vehicles is also falling to below that of petrol vehicles. In 2024, 87% of CapEx on electricity generation went into clean tech. Global South solar and wind generation has been growing over the last 5 years at a rate of 23% a year and already supplies 9% of electricity needs. And in 5 years, it'll slowly climb up to global north levels. Electrification is already 75% of global north levels and growing. Electrification in the global south is 75% of global north levels and growing even faster by the day. As I called out before, recent reports by the IEA and IRENA underscore this growth, which is comforting to know. But they more broadly point to the need for climate finance in the global south, which I won't deny. Using IEA data, we do note that $270 billion will flow into clean energy in the global south in 2024. That's up from 170 billion in 2020, with still room to grow. So already we are seeing the level of investment picking up exponentially. While we do acknowledge that the financial picture isn't fully solved, we do see from the data that there are a relatively limited amount of LIC and LDC demand in low-income countries which need extra support. To that end, we do call on our MDB colleagues, among others, to explore innovative financial instruments such as first loss de-risking of projects and guarantees that do not already add to debt-burdened economies and utilities. Certainly, the negotiations around the new collective quantified goal in Baku are more prescient than ever. We also think that the narrative around 2 times energy efficiency, while we don't call it out in the report, has been drowned out by the very positive news that that our 3 times renewable energy targets are within reach. I'd like to emphasize the importance of energy efficiency as a part of the energy transition to ensure that standards, retrofits, and appliances also keep pace in order to avoid a leaky bathtub of renewable energy molecules. So in summary, today, I'd like to underscore that RMI is in service to local decision makers and policymakers, and that we are agnostic and not taking a position on one economic policy over another. What we're seeing here, backed by fact, is that decision makers are refusing to become hostage to a handful of petrostates that are dominating the Global South narrative. Moreover, they are refusing to become the dumping ground for fossil fuel exporting countries because homegrown, cheap, clean technology just makes economic sense. What we are ultimately demonstrating through this report is that clean tech is the most reasonable path to economic growth. If history proves correct, manufacturing and industry always flow to the least cost source of energy. And that is the aim here, to choose clean technology in order to set countries on a path to realizing economic gains with minimal upfront investment, growing their industrial and manufacturing bases, and expanding their GDPs to take their rightful place in the global supply chains and economy. With that, it's my honor to hand it over to Kingsmill Bond.
Thank you very much, Vikram. So I'm going to go back for a second to the start of this presentation. My name is Kingsmill Bond. I work in the strategy team. And as Vikram said, sorry for 1 second, I'm going to stop the share for a second and share the correct version. 1 moment, sorry. Okay, so I work in the strategy team. As Vikram said, we have been working with the Global South team to develop a coherent fact-based narrative on what's going on in the energy transition in the Global South. And before I plunge in, I just want to say there are 2 key perspectives on the energy future for the Global South, as Vikram alluded to. The first, by the incumbents, assumes kind of business as usual. That is to say, energy demand per person is low, it will rise slowly, and it means more demand for fossil fuels. This props up fossil fuel demand, which is falling across the OECD and China. And you see that very clearly in the report on the left from the US-based EIA. We also hear it all the time from Exxon and the fossil fuel sector. The second, which is our view, assumes, shall we say, instead of business as usual, progress as usual. The Global South, just as they did in telecoms, will take advantage of cheap local technology. By 2040, the electricity use per person will be around 40% higher than under business as usual. And that in turn will act as the foundation for growth and prosperity. So the purpose of this presentation is really to set out why progress as usual is much more likely than the incumbent stagnation scenario. And there are 4 main sections within this. But first of all, we're going to look at what is special about the Global South in the global context. Secondly, we'll look at the facts of what's happening right now. Thirdly, we'll consider why change is likely to continue. And then we I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means for the global story and hand back to Vikram for some observations on what it means for the global south. Okay, so let me just start by setting out terms a little bit. Let's define some terms here, folks. When it comes to energy, the global south is that part of the world which has low levels of energy demand per person and the prospect of significant growth in demand as a result. Again, it's all about growth and low levels of demand. So what that means is that you need to exclude China because China already has higher levels of energy demand per person than Europe. You also, incidentally, have to exclude the two big petro regions of Eurasia and the Middle East, which also have higher levels of energy demand per person than that of Europe. So you're left with these four big regions on the map: Latin America, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. That's 60% of the global population, almost all of the expected growth in both population and energy demand. And to preempt a question we often get, of course, each region, each country, each province, each village, and each household is different. However, there are nevertheless some factors which are relevant to the global south as a whole, and that's what we're looking at in this piece of analysis. So the global south clearly needs energy for reasons of justice, for reasons of convergence. Primary energy demand per person in the global south is just 32 gigajoules. It's a fifth of the level in the global north. Meanwhile, as people know, 700 people terribly have no access to electricity. So it's very clear that for reasons of, as I say, justice and economic convergence, the global south does need to grow its energy demand quickly. The problem with the old way, the fossil fuel way, the way that Europe took 200 years ago, China took 30 years ago, is simply that it's not possible for the whole population, for the 4,600 million people living in the global south, because they don't have enough fossil fuels. 5% of countries in the global south are, of course, petrostates with large amounts of fossil fuels, but for the region as a whole, they are desperately lacking in fossil fuels. To put some bit more context on that, you know, the population of Guyana, the latest big petrostate, is less than 1 million people. Population of the whole global south, which needs energy, is 4,600 million people. So the fossil fuel production at the moment in the global south, this chart showing is just 20 gigajoules. It's less than a fifth of that in the global north, 15 times less than that in the petro regions. And meanwhile, reserves are also tiny relative to population. So the global south has 10 times less reserves per person than the petro region. So if we were trying to go down the old path, the global south would indeed be in real trouble, because it's already causing large amounts of stress. India famously importing $150 billion of fossil fuels a year. The global south on a net basis has just become a net fossil fuel importer because global south doesn't have enough oil and gas. And in fact, oil and gas domestic production has been falling for a while. So you have a real problem with the old system. However, the global south can be a renewable superpower. It's extremely rich in the technology of the present, of solar and wind. The region as a whole is super abundant in solar and wind resources. Their potential is nearly 400 times greater than the fossil fuel production of the region. And this, again, is where we kind of can bring a little bit of the global perspective in. That's another area where they differ radically from the rest of the world. If we look at the other three pieces into which we've split the world, the global north, Greater China, and the petro regions, they all have only 50 times as much renewable potential to fossil fuel production. So it's really quite unique, the amount of opportunity or potential that the global south has. And furthermore, 3/4 of the global south is in the sweet spot of change where you would expect countries to adopt renewables. And again, I want to go through this in a little bit of detail because it's often people confuse specific countries with the wider story. So let's just look a little bit at the facts of the case. So there are 4 factors we look at. Energy demand per person. Are you importer or self-sufficient in fossil fuels? Are you lower middle income or higher? according to the World Bank? And do you have abundant renewable resources? And from our analysis, 73% of the global south fits into all four of these buckets and puts them in the sweet spot of change. And to be clear, 6% of energy demand in the global south comes from low-income states, which really struggle to change. We'll come back to that in a minute. And a further 21% comes from petrostates or high fossil fuel exporters, where the political economy of change is particularly difficult. But let's not forget that 3/4 of the global south is in the sweet spot. And if you look at it on a regional basis, that includes all of South Asia. 85% of Latin America are in the sweet spot of change, along with that around half of Southeast Asia and Africa. And the fact that they are ripe for change explains the sudden jumps in renewable deployment that we have seen in the last 18 months, as we will see in more detail shortly. And then the final observation by way of introduction, setting the scene for the global south within the global context. At the moment, the debate is really, as Vikram alluded to, skewing to a small number of vocal petrostates. Most countries in the global south, folks, from Thailand to Pakistan, India to Egypt or Vietnam, struggle to find enough money to pay for their huge fossil fuel imports. So the global south importers as a whole are spending $370 billion a year on fossil fuel imports. And yet at present, we would suggest the debate is very much skewing to the relatively small number of petrostates and low-income states, which have a very, very different perspective to the rest of the region. Okay, let me move on to the second part of this presentation. There are, just looking at the facts of the case. So is change actually happening? So again, to set the scene, we've done this before. We've looked at other regions in the world. There are three big levers of change in the energy transition. You've got the growth of renewables within the electrons, growing renewables rapidly, mainly driven by solar and wind. They're pushing fossil fuels out of electricity generation. Your second vector of change is electrification. As electricity grows, so it pushes fossil fuels out of final consumption. And then your third primary vector of change is efficiency, the core of a resilient energy system, as Amory Lovins, our founder, pointed out 50 years ago. So the question is, how does the global south compare on these three vectors? And to start with the first vector, the share of renewables in generation, the numbers are extraordinary. And again, Vikram mentioned this at the beginning, but 87% of capital expenditure in 2024, according to the International Energy Agency, is going to be on clean generation. And this is a phenomenon right across the global south. It's 93% in Latin America, 86% in Africa, 84% in Asia. And clean generation capex, so that's a subset of the total Vikram mentioned earlier in the global south, according to the International World Energy Investment, is going to be around $140 billion this year, almost double what it was in 2020. And where capital flows, inevitably generation will follow. So let's again look at the facts of the case. This is exactly what we see. If we focus specifically on the primary driver of change in the electricity sector, that is to say the growth of solar and wind, we see that the global south is actually following a very similar trajectory of growth to what happened in the global north, known as an S-curve. So in 2023, the global south deployed around 50 gigawatts of solar and wind and ended the year with 330 gigawatts in total, according to the International Energy Agency. In 2024, according again to the IEA, they will deploy 70 to 80 gigawatts of solar and wind. So that is to say more than 50% growth in a single year. Now, regions differ, but they're all clearly moving up an S-curve, led by Latin America and then South Asia. If we then compare this story to what happened in the global north, when they too crossed the level of materiality of around 0.5%, we see actually that the global south is a classic example of a fast follower, with change happening faster than in the global north at the same levels. So over 5 years to 2022, solar and wind have grown at a compound annual growth rate of 23% in the global south. It's 11% in the global north. the Global South, as I say, has grown more quickly once you start to rebase the numbers. And it's not surprising, right? The Global South is able to deploy these technologies at a time when the costs are lower and many of the barriers to deployment have been solved by the leaders. And when we go one stage further, have a look inside the Global South, what may surprise you is that actually Latin America and Southeast Asia are actually outpacing China. Both Southeast Asia and LATAM are moving faster up the S-curve than China once it got to this materiality threshold. So again, I think we should not underestimate the capacity of the peoples of the Global South, given cheap options and solutions to deploy this stuff quickly and at scale. If we dive down into the detail of the share of electricity generation coming from solar and wind, we see three groups in the Global South. So 17% of demand is coming from countries that have already leapfrogged the global north level of 15% of electricity from solar and wind. That includes countries from Morocco to Brazil, Mexico to Uruguay. 44% have crossed the famous 5% threshold, commonly associated with the takeoff up S-curve. So that's India or South Africa or Cambodia. And then you have 40% are still below 5%, although again, a number of them are very, very close and actually crossing that threshold as we speak. The second vector of change is electrification. How quickly can you electrify your final energy demand? So here again, we see an even more rapid story of Global South convergence. Over the last decade, electrification has in fact roughly stalled in the Global North, but it's carried on rising in the Global South. So they've gone from 65% of Global North levels to 75% of Global North levels. You have regions like Latin America, Southeast Asia, which are already closing in on Global North levels of electrification. From our calculations, 21% of the Global South has already overtaken the Global North in terms of the electrification of their economies. That includes Egypt, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and South Africa. 59% are catching up the Global North laggards, and then only 20% are in fact below the lower end of the Global North of around 15% electrification. And again, if we start to look a little bit at some of the details inside the electrification story, again, you see this extraordinary S-curve boom taking place in electric vehicle sales as electric vehicle and battery costs fall and Chinese technology pours into the Global South. So we are seeing a classic EV revolution taking place right across the region: Costa Rica, Colombia, Thailand, Vietnam. Again, these are S-curves. They don't stop. They just keep going as costs keep falling. So it sounds like a pretty optimistic picture, but there is a but. You know, we need to be extremely cognizant that change is not universal. There are still barriers to solve. There's every reason to work hard. It's difficult. And there are two specific areas within the Global South which are not yet embracing clean tech. So using here, for example, solar and wind as a share of generation to illustrate the story, the first area where change is not happening, and again, it will come on in our conclusions to what we need to do to solve this, but there is one area where it's really not happening. It's low income states where the share of solar and wind is stagnant, below 3%. It's 6% of energy demand in the Global South, but it's 13% of the population, and many of these folks are living in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a very specific, concentrated area which is not yet enjoying the clean tech revolution. And then the second, on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, is those economies where political economy is holding back change. Where, as you would expect, if you're a huge fossil fuel exporter, a petrostate, which is 5% of demand in the Global South, like Guyana or Algeria or Angola, you're just not deploying clean tech at the moment. And then the second linked is major exporters such as Indonesia and Nigeria, where again, I suspect that's about to change because they're not in the same position as petrostates, but empirically it is nevertheless true that change is not happening in that group of countries either. Share of solar and wind is actually below 1% in those two areas as a whole. So that marks the end of the facts of the case about change actually taking place quite rapidly in the Global South. I'm now going to come on to the third part of this presentation. Why is the Global South highly likely to continue to adopt clean tech. And again, to summarize the story, there are three big drivers of change now. The first, and folks may have heard us talking through this story to global perspective, but it works too in the global south. And in certain areas, it works better, actually. So you've got falling costs of clean tech. You've got plentiful supply of clean tech coming out of China, sparking this race with the West for deployment. And then you've got rising support from domestic policy and international organizations. So those are your three big factors. Let me start with lives and money. Air pollution, mainly from fossil fuels, kills 5 million people a year in the global south, which is 17% of deaths in India, 16% in Egypt. And now, for the first time, policymakers have in their hands a tool to avoid this. Consider that in the IEA business as usual step scenario, we will see pollution from fossil fuels killing 30 million more people between now and 2050 than under their change scenario, their APS scenario. That is to say, what's at stake here is 4 times as many people as died from COVID. It's one life every 30 seconds, every minute for 30 years, or 120 people in the time we have allotted for this presentation. So there's a very powerful pollution argument, and it's not to be understated. Meanwhile, of course, let's think about the economic argument. Renewables are the cheapest source of new electricity right across the global south, which is why, as I mentioned, 87% of generation capex this year is going to be clean. And as costs fall, so these technologies become the cheapest source everywhere. Now, you might well say, okay, we've heard this before. How about capex? Well, how about capex? This is the exciting moment. Again, Vikram alluded to this at the beginning. The main counter-argument is this capex argument. But here too, the world is changing very quickly. Capital costs of clean tech have come down to a level where they are comparable with the capital costs of fossil fuels. So, for example, we are already in 2024 at capex parity for coal versus solar in Vietnam. We're going to be there in India in a couple of years. So if you've got a limited amount of money, you're trying to decide where to put it, you can either buy solar or you can buy coal, you can buy solar or you can buy wind, already at a level of capex parity. Of course, once you've spent the money, you no longer have to buy coal or gas for the next 30 years. So that's the second big benefit of deploying this stuff. If you think in the transport sector, Chinese EVs are now cheaper than ICEs, and these cheap EVs are cascading all over the world. So we do think this is a really important pivotal moment in the energy transition in the global south. It's only just happened because as soon as the capital cost of clean tech is comparable with that of fossil fuels, the main reason to avoid clean tech vanishes. And indeed, as my colleague Sam Butler-Sloss says, it actually flips and it actually drives faster change in the global south. Second factor, China. China has built the solar, the wind, the batteries, the EV capacity to supply the clean tech to the global south. And they've already starting to satisfy a lot of the growth in demand at home. This technology is finding a willing home right across the global south, which is not necessarily subject to the same type of tariff regimes that are being faced in other countries. So, for example, in the last 2 years, solar imports to Namibia, Venezuela, Pakistan have been half of the size of the entire generation system in these countries in 2022. So, as Ember has shown us, if you want to have some fun, look at satellite photographs of Pakistan, you'll see every building covered in solar panels. And I want to quote a Pakistani football entrepreneur: every bit of space I have, even if it is just a few feet, I want it covered in solar panels. It's the only way we can beat our competition in China and India. Now imagine that spirit replicated across 4,600 million people desperately needing energy. This is the story. And now to conclude with the attractions of clean tech for local policymakers, clean tech brings growth, it brings jobs, health, energy, security. Clean tech, to be clear, it's already 20% of GDP growth in China, 30% of growth in Europe. All the growth in energy jobs from 2019 to 22 came from clean tech. All of the future energy jobs are in clean tech. You want jobs, you want clean tech. You want energy security, then Cleantech provides it to you. Almost every country in the world has huge renewable resources, and you just cannot cut off the sun. Talking about speed, you can put renewables up in weeks. This, again, I think is a really important point, and what's more highlighted by the Pakistan example. But if you want more electricity, it's expensive, it's time consuming. If you want to deploy with imported gas, you need shipping routes, LNG terminals, gas pipelines, gas powered plants, electricity network. It takes years. If your LNG supplier decides to cut you off, you're in real trouble. You want it from solar, you need a warehouse to store the panels, you put them on rooftops in weeks, that's it. It's just a very much easier solution. And then the final couple of points here. We shouldn't forget that if you put into place good policies, you're far more likely to attract capital. This is data from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. They do their climate scope analysis. Basically, they're comparing the quality of your policies against the amount of money that you are getting. And you see very, very clear continuum. The better the policy, the more money you get. Of course, this does not apply to all places, especially the 6% of demand in low income countries. But there's a very strong correlation between decent policy and getting the money that you require to deploy the energy. The final observation I'll make in this section, again, we're going to tie this up at the end, it is 6% of demand, most in sub-Saharan Africa, is in countries which are classified by the World Bank as low income. Regrettably, Cleantech is not being deployed in those countries. And this, again, as Vikram said at the start, is precisely where the multinational development banks, the international community can and should step in to apply concentrated deployment of expertise and capital to 6% of the global south to ensure that change happens. Not to say that they should not be assisting everywhere else, but as everything in life, the more you can concentrate, the more you can actually get change done. So I think I'm more or less sticking to time. Coming to the final section, where I'm going to talk a little bit about the global story and then hand back to Vikram to conclude with the story in the global south. So let's think about what this means for the global energy transition. The first observation to make is that fossil fuel demand has already peaked in 1/3 of the global south. So again, if we take the International Energy Agency data, fossil fuel demand peaked in Latin America about 10 years ago. It peaked, it's also peaked in South Africa, peaked in Thailand, it's peaked in Jamaica. It's about 1/3 of demand. Sorry, 1/3 of the global south has already seen peak fossil fuel demand. So that, bear in mind that change is already happening. Furthermore, if I look at electricity, which is the primary vector of change, very simple model, split it into fossil fuels, solar and wind, and other. And at heart is a simple calculation. Solar and wind now around 10% of generation, growing at 23% a year. That's enough to supply electricity demand growth of 2.3%. Because it's continuing to grow, that means actually over 5% by the end of the decade. And yet electricity demand growth in the global south is only 3 to 4%. So it's very clear that by the end of this decade, solar and wind will be able to supply all of the growth in electricity demand in the global south. And this, again, this is not rocket science. It's the same pattern as we have seen in the global north 20 years ago, nearly, and in China, most likely in 2024 or potentially 25. Let's see what happens. But anyway, it's a very clear pattern that's going on. And what that means is that global south will simply not save fossil fuel demand. So one of the big arguments of the fossil fuel incumbents is that the global south is going to prop up somehow fossil fuel demand. So this analysis, this data is simply showing it's a chart of the world split up by global north, Greater China, global south, and the petro regions. I take a couple of scenarios from the International Energy Agency, their business as usual scenario steps and their kind of change scenario APS. And you see decline across the global north and China because of efficiency, electrification, and renewables. But also the prospect of very limited or zero growth in the global south. It's simply not enough to offset the decline that's taking place elsewhere. And as an aside, look at the petro regions on the right. They do their thing. but they're just not big enough. You cannot sustain a giant edifice of 16,000 million tons of fossil fuel demand on such slender pillars of 5% of the global population. So what that means then is that the Global South will be a driver, in fact, of the clean tech revolution. I want you to think very differently about the role of the Global South here. It's not a victim. It's not receiving stuff. It's grabbing the opportunity. It's going to be a driver of the clean tech revolution. By the end of this decade, it will, in fact, be one of the three key pillars of the energy transition, supplying as much growth in demand as the whole of the global north. So I would suggest that the Global South is, in fact, a driver of its own destiny, not a victim of the fossil fuel system. I'm going to hand back to Vikram to think through some aspects of the more wide aspects of the Global South story. Thank you.
Thank you, Kingsmill, mostly for stealing some of my best slides and messages. Uh, but yes, what are the implications of all this for the Global South? And the first point is, as Kingsmill just pointed out, we need to surely revisit some of our old assumptions. In many ways, the Global South is actually better positioned than the Global North for the clean tech revolution. We have the advantage of being a fast follower. I'm not a big fan of the term leapfrogging, but certainly a fast follower. We have a smaller fossil fuel infrastructure and more growth. And we are more open, for various reasons, to cheap Chinese technology. So I remind you here that the rate of change being adopted here is faster than what we saw with the internet and mobile telephony. This is quite unprecedented. On to the next slide. I think the takeaways here are that it's then highly likely that the clean tech revolution will continue in the Global South. It's not going anywhere. To Kingsmill's point, if we bring to bear the S-curve modeling to our analysis, which we've done, then we would expect that solar and wind by 2030 will supply at least a quarter of electricity in the Global South. That's above where China is today. Further, electricity as a share of final consumption in 2030 will be where the Global North is today. That's quite remarkable. That's just 6 years away, practically 5. On to the next. I think here, what I would like to emphasize is that this means that we can expect solar and wind generation in the Global South to be more than 5 times higher in 2030 than in 2022. That is a remarkable turn of events. And we can expect electricity supply per person in the Global South by 2040 to be more than 1/3 higher than the business as usual case in a world driven by rapid deployment of solar and wind technology. This surely is the great upside of the energy transition. It provides energy to those who lack it. And finally, more electricity means faster economic growth. That is the underlying message that we would like to convey to you today, because electricity is the key driver of economic growth in this century. Under most scenarios, electricity will provide all the growth in final energy demand by the end of this decade. That is quite a statement. I imagine many in the audience have a lot to say. I'm going to pause there. I think we've done a lot of talking, and I want to open it up to questions and answers. The tough questions will, of course, go to Kingsmill. I will stay on with the easy ones. And as the tech genius that I am, I'm being fed these live. I will go with the first question. What do you mean by CapEx parity, and why is it important? I believe my colleague put in the chat what we mean by CapEx. It's capital expenditure, the amount of money you're putting forth towards an investment. Why is it important? Think of it as the kit you need to supply energy. So, the kit for solar and wind is now on par with the kit that you need to generate energy, electricity from fossil fuels. Moreover, once you've set up the renewable technology, uh, you're basically generating electricity free of charge. Whereas, to put it in very simplistic terms, with the fossil fuel infrastructure that you set up, you still need to import the coal or natural gas or oil, LNG on a yearly basis, which again is subject to price fluctuations due to conflicts in the Middle East or war in Eastern Europe, and certainly nothing that you as an importer can really control. Um, I think that is an important point of how we're thinking about CapEx and why it's so important to this narrative. Kingsmill, would you add anything to that?
No, that I think that's it.
Okay, let's see. On to the next question. What can we expect from COP29 in Baku? What can we aim for? Wow, that's charged, and I certainly don't want to go too far and speak for the international community. I will speak for, RMI's Global South team. We are hoping for movement on the new collective quantified goal. I think, the 100 billion, as some of you may be aware, $100 billion per year was um, offered from the global north to the global south to deal with climate adaptation and catastrophes. Clearly, that number is not enough. And this analysis doesn't in any way take away from the responsibility that the global north has for the climate crisis. That being said, as Kingsmill said, I don't want the global south to come across here as a victim or with a handout for charity. I think we see here that with private sector forces, with the right reforms, um, the energy transition is entirely possible uh, through the private sector. Uh, but of course, de-risking the cost of capital in key geographies and offering innovative financial instruments will remain a critical part of the discussions going forward, and that is our hope. Kingsmill, would you add anything to that?
No, Vikram, you're doing a great job. I'll let you do the work.
Very good. I will continue on. Um, What are some of the innovative financial instruments that RMI sees as critical to supporting financing the clean energy transition in emerging markets? And what are the biggest barriers by region to the transition? The global north is the global south is a very difficult uh, term because clearly there's a wide variety of countries that we include in that definition. And I think Kingsmill did a very good job of explaining how we define the global south. Um, on one hand, you have the big behemoths like Brazil and India with obviously a great population, great economic industrial base, um, and also deep capital markets. So the nature of the finance discussion in those countries is very different from a country like, for instance, Namibia. And so it's important that we nuance the conversation. Support is needed, uh, innovative support that doesn't add to current choking levels of debt. And there are layers of debt in the global south because of legacy economic policies uh, pushed by both the global north and the global south. And I think we need to actively, as a global community, look at how we can circumvent adding to debt loads. Um, there are mechanisms to do that. There are de-risking mechanisms. There is blended finance. Certain risks, unfortunately, can't be blended away. And so they need to be met head on with innovative policy reforms. Um, and technologies. So I can't offer a panacea here, but that is a flavor of what I think is needed as we look at this broad categorization of countries. What are some of the biggest barriers by region? Um, it's hard to say, the islands, both the Pacific and Caribbean, other parts, are very fragmented. They're very small. So it's hard to really talk about scale. We at RMI have developed various investment facilities that enable institutions, both philanthropic and private sector, to come and look at portfolios of projects, 10, 15 projects, rather than one-off projects on any given island. That seems to make a lot of sense, drive down costs, and become more appealing from an investment perspective. In Africa, of course, we're talking about an abundance of solar. We still see some countries, standing on that platform of fossil fuels. In private conversations, not to overshare, I think most of those countries recognize that they're sitting on an asset base that is declining in value. And so they too are trying to understand how to navigate the fossil fuel economy such that they are moving towards efficiency and then from efficiency onto greening. And that's, again, a broad swath of countries, but a broad narrative. Southeast Asia is the fastest growing and probably the most highly polluting region in the world. They have, the benefit of being close to China, having certain technologies available to them at speed and at a cheaper cost. And we see them really kind of moving quite quickly towards clean energy technology. And again, for them in that region in particular, it's about really economic growth and attracting clean manufacturing, clean industrial jobs, which they've proven to do very capably in the past. And certainly clean energy will be a part of that narrative going forward. Kingsmill, would you add anything to that?
Well, if I may, just there are kind of four classic, and also looking a little bit at some of the other questions, there are four classic barriers to change in many countries: grids, expertise, capital, and political economy. And again, as Vikram said right up front, we're not suggesting any of this is easy. Each of these barriers needs to be solved very clearly. One of the reasons why RMI is working, for example, to train up the folks who are building these systems in the future. When it comes to grids, don't forget that the world as a whole had no grids just over a century ago. We can build grids. We know how to build grids. And if you look at the growth that's taking, the expected growth in the next 30 years, a lot of money is going to need to continue to go to grids. People realize this, but in fact, again, here, new technology and batteries and the very fact that solar is distributed make this easier, in fact, folks. So a very interesting statistic from the Rystad report that came out this morning saying that the grid intensity of solar is much lower than the grid intensity of fossil fuels because you can put solar anywhere. So grids is an issue, but and it needs to get solved, but it's not an insoluble one. Just when it comes to capital, again, if I quote a number from the International Energy Agency, 6% from their numbers of projects require public financing, external public financing, which actually fits very nicely with our 6% is in low-income countries. 40% of projects could be financed from private capital alone. So, for example, solar in India. And then they have 54% need some kind of hybrid. But the point simply is that there's a huge swathe of opportunity where capital can be deployed at speed. And of course, one solution leads to another. And then finally, political economy. I think political economy really, folks, is the key barrier. It's very hard to drive change to a clean tech system if you live in a petrostate. Although again, here, there are chinks of light. Look at Norway, look at Colombia. There are specific countries which see the writing on the wall and realize it's necessary to pivot. But don't forget, again, to answer another one of the questions, Roger's theory of how change happens. You have early adopters, early majority, late majority, laggards. Laggards do not impact change. They're simply laggards. Sorry, I'll hand back to you, Vikram.
Very good, Kingsmill. I think I've been speaking too much, and there's now a hard question, which I will dutifully pass on to you. The U.S. and Qatar are building lots of LNG export capacity. Is that not highly is it not high likely to end up in the global south?
So the key here is to recognize the gap between producers and users. So that is to say, folks might well build stuff in the same way as they built canals, but if there are better solutions, it's not going to get used. And this exactly is what the International Energy Agency is talking about, that by the end of this decade, we're likely to have huge overcapacity of LNG. And then it brings me on to another point that, again, I think you mentioned at the beginning, Vikram, which is that the global north and China are starting to move away from expensive, polluting LNG. And the producers, realizing this, are trying to dump their LNG on the global south, which is simply not fair and is not a solution to the issues faced by the global south, but it is a solution to the problems faced by people who've got a product they want to dump. So it's very, I think people need to be very, very cognizant who's trying to deploy this stuff and why.
Kingsmill, I'm going to give you one more question, and then I will close us out. And this is a good one, and there's very different ways to answer it. Is distributed solar living up to its promise?
So if we take the data from last year, distributed solar is now almost half of all new solar being deployed. So it is living up to its promise, and this is the glory of solar. It can be deployed at any scale, in almost any location. People are now increasingly talking about agrovoltaics, talking about local grids, and individual households being able to use these technologies. And by way of illustration, I think we're going to have to possibly close with this observation about how entrepreneurs in Pakistan are just taking this very cheap Chinese solar and sticking it on their roofs. Any square foot of space that they can get, they're putting this technology onto, and that just completely changes the entire equation. It's not a question of governments necessarily funding this. It's individuals doing it because it has got an incredibly quick payback time, and that's not something that it's easy to stop or control. But it is a great source of opportunity and hope and energy and growth for the peoples of the world.
Thank you, Kingsmill. I think that is an excellent note to end on. Not only is distributed solar energy living up to its promise, I think the message here is that the global south is living up to its promise. I think that the leaders and policymakers are to be commended for the decisions that they are actively making and clearly unleashing for their own destiny in the coming years. It's an honor to do this work. In many years past, it was harder to do this work because the numbers simply didn't add up. Now it just makes economic sense. Making the right choice just makes economic sense. And so the honor of doing this work at this particular time is perhaps more enjoyable than ever. I'd like to thank colleagues who are joining us from around the world, those celebrating holidays, those who are not. Again, from the great Global South team at the Rocky Mountain Institute, thank you.